Hey friends, I don't know about you guys, but Halloween is one of my favorite times of the year. Yet, don't you find that the spookiness is too fun to be confined to just 24 hours? Well, for those of you that said yes, allow me to introduce Shudder. Shudder saw hardcore horror fans decrying the total lack of decent horror films on the other major streaming services and stepped in to save the day. For just $5.99 a month, you can get access to the largest collection of horror films and TV shows ever assembled. You can also download Shudder to a variety of different devices, meaning you can keep watching that gripping movie no matter where you're at. From the latest blockbusters to cult classics, Shudder has something to satisfy every horror junkie. They even have a bunch of dedicated horror documentaries such as Eli Roth's History of Horror, and their Collections feature is just awesome, grouping together certain movies to showcase female directorial talent or to curate a certain subgenre. I've enjoyed a lot of Shudder's extensive library, as you've heard before, but the standout show has to be Channel Zero, as it's inspired by something very close to my heart. I started this channel reading old school creepypastas, so to me, the fact that Channel Zero has brought some of those old classics to life is just incredible. My jaw just hit the floor when I realized the first season is based on Candle Cove, and I was hooked by the time I heard the second season is based on The No End House. I'm pretty sure a lot of you will be familiar with the Search and Rescue Woods series that was on Reddit. Well, that's the basis for Season 3, and Season 4 is inspired by Hidden Door. All 4 seasons defied my expectations, and they have to be some of the most original pieces of horror TV that are available right now. So if you're looking for that new spooky series to binge, look no further than Shudder. Because by visiting their website, Shudder.com, and using my promo code Let's Read, you can get 30 days of all the horror movies you can watch without spending a penny. So, head over to Shudder.com, that's SHUDDER.com, and enter the promo code Let's Read, LETSREAD, and sink your teeth into some exceptional eldritch entertainment so you can keep that Halloween spirit alive. I grew up in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro. Rio is a city that lives by its own rhythm, and to an extent it lives by its own rules too, meaning there are many favelas or slums in the city where the police have no power. Instead, authority is held by the local drug traffickers. It's gotten better since I was a boy. The traffickers used to control more than half of the city, but now they control less than a third. But unfortunately, neither me nor my family were around to witness the improvement as we moved out of Rio when I was a teenager. And our move was prompted by one of the most tragic and horrible events in our family's history, the death of my older brother Lucas. Lucas was always the smart one of the family. Even when he was just a little kid, all the people in our favela called him Little Professor, because he always wore his glasses and white school shirt even on Saturdays. He was good at all of his school subjects, but it was science, and particularly chemistry, that set a fire in him. He was obsessed. Day and night, he read his science books, and he would always tell me about how one day he was going to go to university and make us all very proud. You can only imagine how proud we really were when his acceptance letter arrived all those years later. He was headed to the state university in the Maracana district to study chemistry, the first in our family to ever attend college. He was our family's ticket out of the favelas. I know that sounds like a lot of pressure, but it's true. And unlike some kids who might not feel comfortable with that sort of responsibility, Lucas relished it. But his family, friends, and neighbors weren't the only ones who noticed how intelligent and talented my brother was. Like I said, the narco-traffickers held almost complete and total control over the favelas. Police would come and go, maybe shoot a few traffickers every so often, but it was like fighting guerrilla warfare for them. Many of the favelas are built onto hillsides, so the whole way the police would be fighting uphill against a well-armed and highly motivated enemy. They always used to try to surprise the traffickers, ambushing them in helicopters and sometimes like special forces. But the traffickers had lookouts and they paid them well, so there wasn't a single time the police tried to come into the favela without all the neighboring kids shouting, "Cochinas, cochinas," the nickname for the police in my area, Brazil. So, you see, there was almost nothing they could do. In many places, the government simply abandoned people to the mercy of the narco-traffickers, and my area was one of those. And the gang in control was named Comando Vermelho, or in English, the Red Command. Comando Vermelho, or CV as I'll just call them from now on, they didn't just deal in drugs either. They were like a paramilitary organization at one time, more interested in politics than making money. But over time, I think the riches that came from trafficking narcotics corrupted them, and soon, they were a criminal gang much like any other. But my God, they were entrepreneurs too. They sold tickets to big street parties called Baile Funk, produced their own music and clothing merchandise, and not only did they traffic drugs, they made drugs too. Comando Vermelho was in the business of making ecstasy and other party drugs, which was mainly sold at the Baile Funk parties. And so they needed people with the skills to help run their parties. They needed organizers, DJs, sound and light technicians. All kinds of different people were on CV's payroll. They also needed someone smart to manufacture their party drugs such as ecstasy, GHB, and 2CB. And that's where Lucas came to their attention. Although he lived in a dorm over near the university, Lucas would come back to the favela every weekend in order to spend time with us. Normally, he would arrive in a great mood, full of stories about his new friends and his exciting new studies. But one time, Lucas came home troubled, and when her parents asked him what was wrong, he made some excuse up about having too much late-night study sessions. But I knew that wasn't the issue, because the very same people that were causing Lucas problems were the same people that had approached me just a few days before. I had been walking home from school when I was approached by a guy called Cabacion. Not his real name, just a nickname meaning big head. Because Cabacion really did have such a big head, everything he did was a masterpiece. Every move he made a genius stroke of strategy. He was always right, and God help anyone who tried to tell him he was wrong, because he was one of CV's top guys in our favela. Cabacion and his friends wanted to talk to me, and so I had no choice but to answer their questions. "When's your brother in town?" he asked me. I told him the weekend. If I'd have lied, they'd have beaten me. They didn't stop there either. They asked me what bus route he'd take, where his dorm was. I answered everything as best I could, but you can bet I answered, I don't know, for most of it. But still, it was more than enough for them to find him, and when they did, they demanded he drop out of university to work for them. When they told him he'd be better paid than any civilian laboratory, I believe that to be true, but joining CV reminds me of something I heard in the United States. Gangs only lead two places, the jail cell or the grave. And that's exactly how it was with CV too. So naturally, Lucas didn't want to join, and negotiating with Cabacion, such as telling him that he would only work on weekends, well, that didn't fly with a guy who was always right. In the end, Lucas showed bravery that few people could find within themselves when faced with the brutality of CV, and so he told them no. The next weekend that Lucas came home, he wasn't just unhappy, he was beaten to a pulp. He walked into our home with bruises and cuts all over him. Mother and father asked what had happened, and he just told them, "Some boys mugged me." They believed him and begged him to be more careful when traveling home, but us brothers knew the truth. Cabacion had him beaten up as a warning for his disobedience. That night, as we tried to sleep, I told my brother not to come home anymore. It wasn't safe for him. Nothing was stopping us from traveling to visit him at his dorm or around the university campus. Sure, it would cost us money when it was tight, and sure, it meant he wouldn't be able to eat fresh home cooking, but it would at least protect him from being beaten up again. That worked for a while, but then Cabacion just started targeting me instead, having his crew beat me up and demanding I summon my brother back to the favela. When he heard what they were doing to me, he was determined to put a stop to it. I begged him not to come home, pleaded with him not to fall for their trick, but he had it in his head that he could buy us some time by lying about working for them. That was the thing about Lucas. Once he got something into his head, once he had made up his mind, there was no stopping him, no talking him round. So after weeks of not visiting our mom and dad, he called them to say that he'd be home at the weekend. All my relatives were very excited, and I had to fake being happy about it so that they wouldn't question what was going on. I remember he was due home on a Friday at around 6 p.m., but then, thanks to Rio's terrible public transport system, he was always a little later than his stated time. 7 p.m. went by, 8 p.m. went by, and there was still no sign of Lucas. The next morning, when he still hadn't turned up, we all started to get very worried. My mom and dad called his dorm room, but his dorm mates said that they hadn't seen him since the night before. And that's when I broke down crying and I told them everything. All about how CV wanted him to make drugs and that he hadn't been mugged that time he came home with a swollen face, and how I hadn't gotten into fights in school. It had all been Cabecion and his crew. Mom and Dad went into overdrive, calling all the family and asking if they knew anyone inside CV. An uncle of ours knew a guy who was closely associated with them, and together they set about looking for Lucas. We'd assumed they had kidnapped Lucas to make drugs for them and that raising some ransom money might secure his release. The reality was worse than we could have ever imagined. The Tuesday after Lucas disappeared, my uncle and his friend arrived at our house to tell my mom and dad that they'd found Lucas. But the way they said it, the sad looks on their faces, it told them all they needed to know. My mom started wailing and my dad had to restrain her. I didn't cry. I was just numb, and thinking back on it all these years later, I think it was because I knew he was dead already. He died the moment he told Cabecion and Comando Vermelho no. Lucas had a closed-casket funeral, but for years, I didn't question why. Then a long time later, years after we'd moved to Sao Paulo to get away from the favela, me and the same uncle were still drunk after Carnival, sitting on the roof of our home while the sun rose over the mountains. We had something of a heart-to-heart, and it was only then that I found out how Lucas had died. The final weekend he came home, Cabecion and his crew met Lucas at the bus station. When he told them they needed to talk, Cabecion told him, "Fine, but we need to talk somewhere more private." Cabecion and his crew then walked Lucas up to a very high place in our favela, one of their hangouts that had an amazing view over the whole favela. Cabecion explained to Lucas that he has accepted that he would not work for CV. They could find other chemists. That was not the problem. The problem was that if word got out that one young man had defied CV, that all sorts of people would decide to be brave and also tell them no. And that could not be allowed to happen. So, as a warning to everyone in the favela, they beat Lucas up, tied him upright to a pole, then began to stack tires around him, threading him like a needle through the loops. After that, they poured petrol over him and set him on fire. Everyone in the favela who was looking out their windows that night could see my brother burning, and I thank God that me and my parents either weren't awake to see it or were ignorant of it going on. And I also thank God that my parents had the strength and courage to move us away from Rio, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, but one with far too many bad memories for us to stay. A few years back, I decided to do some solo backpacking around Central America to improve my Spanish. I found languages to be kind of boring in high school, and I was surprised as anybody when I found myself with a sudden burning passion for hablo español. I know it sounds incredibly corny, but it was the song Despacito that sparked the whole thing off. I just thought it'd be so cool to understand what the guy was singing about, then having the lady in my bodega smiling and complimenting me, even though I only said how much, and gracias. It was such a rush, and it gave me something to occupy my mind with whenever I was doing housework or going for a run. But soon I wanted to test my Spanish out where it really mattered, not down in a local taco truck, but where I'd have to rely on it to get by. Latin America. I started off in Mexico. Everything was fantastic, the people were wonderful, and I heard of very little cartel violence during my travels south. But I'm sad to say that the further and further south I got, the sketchier things seemed. Please don't get me wrong. The people I had problems with were a tiny minority, and every time I got into trouble, it was the locals who'd come to the rescue of the gringa, treating me no differently than they treat a neighbor or a guest in their own home. But it got to the point where I had a couple of really close calls, the worst of which was probably in Guatemala. So one night, I'm out exploring the capital Managua when I started to get pretty tired and wanted to head back to my hostel. The way it works is that outside all the bars and cafes, especially the ones gringos tend to visit, there are all kinds of taxi drivers lined up outside with their cars, waiting to ferry them around. So I walk out, ask a guy if he's a taxi driver, then start negotiating price with him. When he says 20, I take him up on it because 20 Guatemalan quetzal is only about $2.50. But then when we arrived at my hostel and I offered him the money, he locks the doors and tells me he wasn't talking about Guatemalan currency at all. He was talking US dollars. It was an obvious scam. He tried to play dumb, saying, "I always negotiate with people in their own currency. Quetzals are complicated. I was doing you a favor." And then accused me of being the scammer and threatening to call the police. In retrospect, it was a total bluff on his part, and he probably wasn't even a licensed taxi driver, but it totally worked. I was terrified. I just took the path of least resistance, and he cleared me out of about 150 quetzals, the equivalent to $20, so basically a few days' wages for this guy in one short fare. I felt dumb, thinking all my friends catastrophizing about being a female solo traveler were basically proven right. But in reality, it could have been so much worse. I kind of trudged into my hostel, feeling terrible, when one of the staff members asked me if I was okay. I told them, "No, soy estúpida," and then basically poured my heart out as best I could about how I'd just fallen for what my limited vocabulary could only describe as bandido. That's when the girl started to talk really fast about something, using words I didn't always understand, but I remember catching the words, "another girl, attacked, and dead," so I knew it was serious. In the end, she explained the situation to another guest whose Spanish was much better than mine, and she relayed the info to me. Basically, about 2 months before my travels, another North American, she turned out to be Canadian in the end, had been staying in another hostel across town. A taxi driver had tried the exact same scam with her, claiming he'd been talking about US dollars when he'd led her to believe he was referring to quetzals. But instead of just giving in and paying up, this girl refused, then put up a fight when the guy had tried to lock her in his car. She sounded brave, really brave, but the driver was strong, and once he'd beaten her unconscious, he drove her out into the middle of nowhere and violated her. When he was done, she was unconscious and wouldn't wake up, so thinking she was dead, he tossed her in a stream and then fled the area. But she wasn't dead, and a few school kids found her the very next morning on their way to class. It was horrifying to hear and so bizarre to think that I wished so hard that I put up a fight too. Only if I had listened to that voice that said, "Don't stand for this, don't let this idiot scam you," I might have never made it home. So I suppose this is a really long-winded way of telling people that if you do travel to Guatemala and you're going to take taxis, only ever travel with guys who have a red stripe on the top and the bottom of their license plate. Everyone else is a fake. I was traveling on the train alone in Argentina, just out to see some of the more suburban sights, and after a long day, I caught the train back alone. It was past sunset, but the train was still pretty busy, I guess with commuters and such, so I was forced to stand. I was reading My Little Pony Planet Guide, just minding my own business. Then when the train was approaching a stop, a bunch of people got up from their seats to get off the train. Because I wasn't quite paying attention, I found myself stuck in a mini press as people prepared to get off. And when the doors opened, 3 pretty rude guys just tried to push past me all at once and almost succeeded in pushing me off the train in doing so. I screamed at them like, "Hey, watch yourself." But they just ignored me. Then, out of nowhere, I hear this young voice shouting at them, and all of a sudden she's grabbing me by the arm and pulling me back onto the train. It was only then that I realized what was happening. They weren't just rude train passengers pushing to get off. It was a concerted effort to push me off the train before they were going to do God knows what with me at some barely lit, mostly abandoned station. It all just happened so fast, and I can see why it might work if there wasn't someone savvy watching to recognize what was going on. The same girl then explained that, in a mix of Spanish and broken English, that it's something that happens a horrifying amount in Buenos Aires and other big Argentine cities. After that, she helped me get back to hostel safely while warning me not to be out in shorts in a tank later at night, especially if I was alone. Back when I was a student, I went traveling around South America during my gap year, ending up in Colombia and Bolivia for the better part of my stay. Colombia is pretty wild, but Bolivia even more so, and saving a few Bolivianos by traveling around the countryside by bus proved to be the single biggest mistake of my travels. The worst bus I traveled on was named something silly and feminine like La Cristabel or whatever, or it was more accurately should have been named the Vomit Comet because it lurched and shook for 4 hours straight whilst going up and down these winding mountainous roads. Then at one point, and bearing in mind we all see out the big front window of the bus, we come around this tight corner way, way too fast, only to see a bus coming down the mountain at us at breakneck speeds. I remember thinking, that's it, we're dead. Because if it had hit us, we'd have been sent crashing down the mountainside, literally hundreds of feet down below. Everyone was screaming, bracing for impact, but somehow, the other bus managed to slow down enough to come to a complete stop, just feet away from us. It was the one true near-death experience I've had in my life, and I honestly wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But even more surreal when the drivers got out all aggressively, presumably to fight each other. They must have recognized each other because they were hugging and shaking hands just moments later. I was just about at my wit's end, but the Bolivians around me were back to whining about how humid it was within minutes, like we hadn't almost just plummeted down the mountain in a fiery bus wreckage. It did make me feel grateful that all I have to worry about in the UK is expensive train fare. This happened way back in the 90s, but I was backpacking Colombia and was stunned at the number of homeless people in Bogota. It was honestly awful. I think at the time that almost a fifth of Colombia's population either didn't have adequate housing or didn't have anywhere to stay at all. It was crushingly depressing, and as harsh as it sounds, the only way for me to cope being around it was to just ignore it altogether. Just typing that made me feel gross. But as a blonde American girl, they all assumed you just had money to burn. But if you give money to one homeless person in central Bogota, then forget about it. You just get mobbed with people asking you for pesos. The only way to get around was like if someone asked you for money, just power past them. Don't make eye contact, don't talk, just keep moving and they get the message. Then one night I'm walking down the sidewalk when I see this guy stumbling around like he's drunk. The whole time he's got his back to me and he's reaching out to passers-by, but they're just playing the ignoring game, not looking or talking to him. That's when it's my turn to pass him. I do so kinda close enough to see the guy had a freaking steak knife sticking out of his chest, like one of those wooden-handled ones. He wheezes out a weak, "Ayúdame," as I got close, then just collapsed into a heap on the sidewalk. Seeing that handle just sticking out of his chest was one of the most frightening things I've ever seen, and I know I let out a blood-curdling scream when I saw how much blood was oozing onto the concrete. I don't know who stabbed him, and I don't know if he survived his trip to the hospital, but people were acting like it was an everyday thing for them, which honestly was even more horrifying than the dude's stab wound. My first time out of the States was as an 18-year-old volunteer to a children's charity in Guyana. I don't even think I can accurately put how excited I was into words, and that goes for the country's natural beauty too. It was indescribable in the very sense of the word. Yet although I wouldn't say I regret going to Guyana, the trip included one of the most traumatic and terrifying experiences of my entire life, and it's one that a lot of travelers at that time could relate to. So, before my trip, I had to get a bunch of shots at the doctor's office, and while I was there, I was given a few packets of anti-malaria pills to take when I was there. The doctor told me that it was super important that I take them every day at certain times, all that stuff. So what does stupid me go and do on the third day there? I lose the frickin' anti-malaria pills. It's not even like we're in the city or on the coast either, where the mosquitoes aren't so bad. We're right in the middle of the jungle, and I'm not kidding when I say that. In some wetter places, the mosquitoes were literally like a black cloud floating over the creek or the lake or whatever. It was so gross, and without my malaria pills, I was in serious trouble. Naturally, first thing I do is head over to my team's leader's hut to tell him my problem. He tells me not to worry because he was making the 2 hours round trip to the nearest large town that afternoon. The town had a small clinic that could provide them with anti-malarial pills, and for really cheap too. Problem solved, right? All the guy told me was, the pharmacist said these might make you feel a little woozy in the first few days. But hey, that was much better than getting actual malaria, which is an awful disease, by the way. But anyway, I take my pills, carry on with the program, and kind of forget about the whole thing for a while. Until, that is, I start feeling way worse than just woozy. At first, I just sort of felt off. It's hard to describe. Not sick so much as just anxious. I just didn't understand why either. Everyone was so nice and friendly to me, and the program itself was running really smoothly and efficiently. The kids were amazing. The food was beyond good. Think Caribbean food, only with way more African influences. And the place we were staying was shockingly well maintained for what was basically just a camp in the jungle. But still, I just felt all wrong, and after a few days, it really started to mess with me. By the end of the first week, things had gotten really bad. I was waking up every single night, drenched in sweat, having just suffered through the most vividly horrifying nightmares I've ever had. It was hell on my bunkmates too, like I'd literally be screaming and they'd have to shake me awake. Then I'd be crying and that would keep them up too. I just felt like a total idiot out there, just making everyone else's life difficult, but that's only when I was lucid enough to actually think properly. The rest of the time, I was just gripped by this feeling of pure dread. Like that's honestly what it was. That feeling you get when you know something bad is about to happen. Not think or suspect it. Know that something bad is about to happen. That's what was so hard to articulate to people at the time. It wasn't just worry. It was pure terror. Terror that I just wasn't going to make it out of Guyana alive. And what was legitimately brain-breaking was that I had no idea why I felt that way. In the end, it got so bad that I honestly didn't want to be there anymore, but I also knew that something was wrong with me. Like seriously wrong. Our team leader, Ryan, didn't want to take me back to the little clinic in the nearby town, but he had heard of a French medical charity that was in the area, and that we'd probably have better luck there if it came to psychological issues. So, get this, we drive out to where they're based, and we managed to find a doctor there who spoke English. This guy is an actual Disney prince, and there I am, sweating, having barely slept in days, just like, kill me now, this is the worst time of my life. In his gorgeous French accent, I tell him what my problem is, and he's as confused as we are. He asks me if I have a history of mental health problems, which I don't. He asks me if I've been unhappy in the teaching program. I tell him no. But then I mention how the whole thing seemed to start after I lost my malaria medication. Like that kicked off a head spiral of negativity that I just couldn't shake off. It was almost like since one bad thing had happened, then all the bad things could happen. But as I'm saying this, the dreamy French doctor just raises a hand, stops me talking, and asks, "What's the name of the malaria medication you're using now?" I had no idea, but I remembered it began with an L. The doctor instantly said, "Lariam?" Which, yeah, he nailed it. That's exactly what it was. The doctor then goes on to explain that his charity refuses to stock or distribute Lariam because it causes paranoia, psychosis, and heightened aggression. He told me he had no idea how the drug made it onto the market, as it's been responsible for some literal horror stories involving soldiers going crazy and stuff. It was a drug that made you literally go crazy, and I've been taking it for almost 9 days at that point. The doctor told me to stop taking the Lariam immediately and provided me with some alternate medications that wouldn't have the same horrible side effects. My symptoms disappeared within 48 hours, and I was able to continue the rest of the teaching program without a hitch. All that because of some anti-malarial pills. It's hard to even fathom that they could have that kind of effect on me. Like, I get that if they make you feel sick, like some anti-malarial pills do, but to make it feel like you're literally going insane, that's like something out of a Stephen King novel. Last I heard, whatever evil pharma corporation that produces it was about to take it off the market, but I mean, too little too late, right? I'm pretty sure there are people who are owed a lot of money over that stuff, maybe even myself included. Just be careful what you're putting in your body, people. If something has been proven to be a benefit, I'll be the first to take it. But just taking some random doctor's word as gospel was a huge mistake, and I think I almost paid for it with my life. So, a whole bunch of my extended family lives down in Colombia, and every couple of summers we'd pretty much pack up our life here in California to live with them for a few weeks. I say pack up our life because on this one occasion, my mom insisted on bringing her entire wardrobe. My dad brought his power tools, you'll see why in a minute, and we even brought the family dog. I mean, I get it, we were staying out there for 3, maybe 4 weeks at a time, and in this case, our relatives had moved into a new ranch out in a place called Cauca, so my dad brought his tools to help my uncle fix the place up, as there was still a lot of work to be done. So, we flew down to Bogota with an embarrassing amount of luggage, hired a van which took us down to Popayán, the regional capital of Cauca, and then made our way out to a place called El Plateado, which is where our relatives had moved. Well, we tried to drive out to El Plateado because my dad managed to get us spectacularly lost thanks to his hopeless outdated Colombian road map. We were due to arrive at my cousin's place around midday, but we were still on the road in the early evening, and it didn't look like we'd make it until after sundown. It would have been way worse if we didn't have Pepper with us, that's our dog, but Pepper also needed to stretch her legs and pee much like we did, so there came a point where we stopped to take a rural bathroom break. Pepper practically bolted out of the van when we slid the side door open, running into this big open field while she barked with delight. I was excited to run around and play with her, not so excited to clean up the mess she'd make, but seeing her all excited to be in a faraway place was just so freaking adorable. Right up until I saw a big red and white sign that had been staked into the field. It had this huge skull and crossbones on it and the words Peligro Minas on it, which for those of you that don't speak Spanish means danger, mines. I just about soiled myself and started screaming for Pepper to get off of the field. She just kind of looked up from me a second with this, huh? Look, then carried on sniffing around for a place to do her business. Every single second that went by was one in which I thought I was about to watch my beloved pooch explode in a shower of flesh, guts, and fur. I used to seriously not be able to talk about this for a long, long time because the trauma would just have me bawling and incoherent. I know that might sound pretty lame, but it's more the fact that Pepper was okay. She just squatted, took a pee, then made her way back to us without getting so much as a scratch. Mom and Dad were just about having a fit by the time she was safely out of the field, and same as I was. I think the shock of being faced with an actual minefield just hours after leaving the relatively safe Sacramento, I think that's what really had us freaking out. For those of you that are like, what is a minefield in Colombia for? There's been this crazy civil war that went on for generations and has only just ended in the past 10 years or so. Some of Colombia is the most heavily mined land on the planet, and although the government and various NGOs are still in the process of clearing them out, there are still a whole bunch of mines left over from the war. We ended up getting to our family's ranch safely, and the rest of the trip was amazing. But you can bet my dad bought a new road map after nearly getting our dog blown up. I was backpacking in the Andes a few years back when a fire started just outside the camp early in the morning. Chile gets some real bad forest fires at certain times of the year, and it's just something you have to work around if you're going to hike during those times of year. It was a small fire when we set out for the day, and we intended to do about 10 miles with a big 3,500 foot of elevation gain. Our guide thought the fire was moving at a rate of about 5 miles a day, in which case we'll be well out of danger by the end of the day's hike. But about 2 hours in, there's so much smoke from the fire that it's almost just about blocked out the sun. Then we turned around to see an absolute massive wall of smoke blowing up the hill behind us, and you could almost feel the tension pick up as we realized we were in a lot of trouble. We couldn't turn around because the fire was behind us. The wind was increasingly strong and pushing the flames of the valley, but it looked increasingly unlikely that we'd be able to make it up the steep side of the valley without the flames catching up to us. The only relief we got was seeing a huge number of helicopter and planes flying right over our heads, conducting fire suppression runs over a wide area. It's like they were warplanes providing us with air support, dropping bombs on our enemy as we fled up the side of the valley. Every single time I saw one, I was filled with the hope of survival. We spent the next 5 hours walking and running uphill in an increasingly dark and red-tinted sky, with thicker and thicker smoke around us, the sound of the fire raging in the valley below, and the sound of helicopters and other aircraft could no longer see. And the sound of helicopters and other aircraft could no longer be heard. It was an actual nightmare come to life, and I saw things that day that I'll never get out of my mind. When we finally reached the camp we were heading toward, we were told they were evacuating and anyone capable of doing so should keep walking another 10 miles to the nearest government highway. They ended up rescuing over 200 people by helicopter before the day was over because people just kept dropping from exhaustion and dehydration, and the section of the trail we were on was burnt out less than 3 hours after we were there. When it was over, I was absolutely destroyed, emotionally and physically. We ended the day in the dark with headlamps by the time we got to the road. There were some people ferrying hikers from the trailhead to the campground, and I completely broke down when I saw them. That whole experience gave me a new lease on life. It really did. I came home to America so grateful for all that I've got, and grateful to even be alive. For some, the concept of the charming, handsome serial killer is quintessentially American. The mythos built up around Ted Bundy and his ability to endear and disarm is perhaps the most well-known of any serial killer, while the dissonant perversity of John Wayne Gacy and his child-friendly clown persona are enough to give nightmares to even the hardiest of true crime aficionados. The concept has also been explored in countless movies, be they American Psycho, Dirty Harry, or the cult classic Halloween. But you may be surprised to know that the world's most prolific serial killer, the one with the highest body count to his name, is in fact from South America. Born on October 8th of 1948 in Santa Isabel, Colombia, Pedro Alonso Lopez was exposed to things that no child should ever see. The seventh child in a group of 13 siblings, Pedro was not only hideously neglected, but he and his family lived in an area stricken with extreme poverty. As a result, people selling their bodies was rife, and Pedro apparently witnessed several incidences of perverted depravity while still of a single-digit age. This had a profoundly negative effect on his psyche, and after being caught violating his younger sister when he was just 8 years old, his mother threw him out of the family home, forcing him to fend for himself. The 8-year-old exile was forced to travel to the Colombian capital Bogota in order to look for work, and it's there that he was taken advantage of by several older men, many of which abused him. This only worsened Pedro's psychological condition, making him extremely volatile, distrustful, and depressive. By age 12, Pedro was fortunate enough to be taken in by a U.S. immigrant family and enrolled in a school for orphans. By all accounts, the family was kind to him, but Pedro ran away after just 2 years at the orphan school. According to one account, it's because he had been subjected to abuse by one of the male teachers. However, several other sources state that he actually ran away with this teacher, and the relationship was a consensual one. Whatever happened from the ages of 14 to 17, by age of 18, Lopez was making a steady living by stealing cars and selling them to local chop shops. It earned Pedro a decent living, at least until the law caught up with him. After a hasty trial, Pedro was sentenced to a brief but brutal jail term, during which he was repeatedly assaulted and violated by other inmates. Pedro claimed that he took revenge on his attackers throughout his time there, murdering the majority of them in attacks that remained a mystery to prison officials. However, it's not clear how true this is, as Pedro neither named nor gave details on these revenge killings. But what's clear is that upon his release, Pedro decided he was finished with Colombia and moved across the border to neighboring Peru. He also spends stretches of time in Ecuador, claiming that, "I like the girls in Ecuador. They are gentler and trusting, more innocent." And it seems Pedro took advantage of their gentler, more trusting nature by murdering them. By the year 1978, Pedro had apparently murdered more than 100 women and girls throughout South America. He would normally lure them into his car before driving them out to a secluded location, where he would strip, assault, and strangle them before ditching their bodies in places they'd have little chance of being found. Pedro also had a habit of hanging around marketplaces, buying food for those who needed it as a way to earn their trust. But you can bet it was a trust he soon abused, as the person in need made their last, deadliest mistake. Yet perhaps Pedro's most favorite group to target were the region's indigenous people. Social injustice had meant that these people had been ignored or denied agency for years, and local authorities were not nearly as keen to investigate disappearances or crimes against them. But that doesn't mean that the local Ayachucos Indians were prepared to take the abuse lying down. And when Pedro attempted to kidnap a 9-year-old tribal girl, the Ayachucos captured Pedro and prepared to execute him. Yet in a bizarre twist of fate, a nearby Christian missionary organization heard of the capture and managed to convince the Ayachucos not to execute Pedro and to hand him into the authorities instead. Yet to their utter dismay, the Peruvian authorities released Pedro back to Colombia, who somehow failed to prosecute on him for any crime whatsoever. It's then that Pedro moved on to Ecuador, where he claimed he killed 3 girls a week for almost 2 solid years before his luck finally ran out. In March of 1980, Pedro attempted to abduct a girl in a marketplace in Ecuador, but was rumbled by an observant citizen and cornered by an angry mob. Word is he was just minutes from being lynched when the police finally got involved, arresting Pedro and taking him into custody before the mob could burn him alive. It was while in a jail cell that Pedro confessed to an astonishing 103 murders, 53 of which had been positively identified. However, Despite the police confirming he'd killed 53 women and girls, they didn't quite believe the scale of his crimes. Many serial killers embellish their kill counts when captured, possibly as one last act of malice, robbing victims' families of their chances at learning the truth. However, less than a year into his incarceration, a freak episode of flash flooding revealed a huge mass grave of his victims, and the police were forced to accept the horrifying magnitude of Pedro's crimes. He described himself as El Hombre del Siglo, or the Man of the Century, and made the outrageous claim in a press interview that he would soon be released on good behavior. Coming from a man who deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison, this was a preposterous boast, but you'll no doubt be horrified to learn that Pedro was eventually proven right. On August 31st of 1994, Pedro was inexplicably released from prison by an Ecuadorian judge, but was then immediately rearrested as an illegal immigrant before being extradited back to Colombia. Thankfully, he was instantly detained and charged with murder upon his arrival at the Colombian border, but he somehow managed to dodge the hefty prison sentence he deserved. Colombian authorities declared Pedro to be clinically insane and sent him to the psychiatric wing of a Bogota hospital, the security of which was shockingly under par considering what a dangerous individual he was. Then, just 4 years later, in 1998, a team of Colombian psychiatrists convened to analyze Pedro's case, and after an indeterminate period of study, declared him legally sane. Yet instead of seeking to actually punish him for his murderous past, Colombian authorities released him from prison on nothing but $50 bail and a set of relatively lax conditions. This is a man who confessed to the murder of literally hundreds of women and young girls, a man who didn't deserve to feel the sun's warmth on his face for the remainder of his miserable life, and the authorities saw it fit to set him free. Unsurprisingly, Pedro soon cut off contact with his parole officer and absconded from the halfway house he was residing at following his release. One of the most dangerous men in the world had completely dropped off the police's radar. It was a display of incompetence so shocking that the International Criminal Police Organization, commonly known as Interpol, was forced to step in and issue a warrant for his arrest. It took them almost 4 years to find a pertinent murder to charge him on, owing to the dire disorganization of the Colombian justice system, and as of 2002, he is wanted in connection with a number of unsolved murders. If it isn't obvious by now, there is no end to Pedro's story yet. Most of who we might assume are the worst serial killers are either dead or in prison. Yet Pedro Lopez, a man thought to have murdered more than 300 people, could possibly be alive and well, and living freely somewhere in either Colombia, Peru, or Ecuador. I don't know about you, but I don't believe for a second that a man who once killed 3 people a week could possibly go the rest of his natural life without indulging his one true passion. So remember, if you're planning on visiting rural Colombia anytime soon, just remember that there's a monster in the hills, but not one of folklore or myth, one of flesh, of blood, and unimaginable evil. Every year, it is estimated around 200 to 300 people lose their lives on a stretch of road less than 50 miles long. This road, running from Bolivia's capital city, La Paz, to a region known as the Yungas, was constructed by Paraguayan prisoners of war back in the 1930s and is an astonishing 3 miles above sea level. Many of those same prisoners of war perished during the effort, but now it is mainly Bolivians who die on the road, and they do so in their thousands. In 1995, an organization known as the Inter-American Development Bank named the Yungas Road as the most dangerous transport route in the entire world. If you're unlikely enough to be traveling on the road as you start your descent, your driver whispers a quiet prayer, and it's not long before you begin to see why such an experienced driver might be so terrified to traverse it. A gargantuan vertical crack appears, and soon you find you're driving on little more than a cliff's edge. Far below, more than half a mile beneath your passenger window, you can see a thin silver thread cradled between canyon walls. It looks like little more than a trickling stream, but in reality, it's the huge Coroico River, rushing to join the even greater Amazon. On the opposite side of the half-mile drop, there is a sheer rock wall rising up hundreds of feet into the air, meaning the threat from landslides above is almost as great as the deadly fall below. Only the bravest or most foolhardy of drivers ever take the road, and with the road being barely 3 meters wide, there is no margin of error. Bolivia is an overwhelmingly Christian nation, but it seems their fear of the Yungas Road leads them to seek solace in much more ancient deities. It's not uncommon to see drivers sometimes stopping to pour beer into the dirt at the side of the road, an act intended to beseech the goddess Pachamama for safe passage. Following their tribute to the old pagan goddess of fertility, drivers will often shove a wad of coca leaves into their mouths, chewing on it relentlessly in order to absorb the stimulating chemicals which keep them awake and focused. It's at this stage that we learn something as confounding as it is horrifying about those that drive the Yungas Road. You'd think that such a dangerous stretch of highway would warrant low and careful driving from those that travel along it, but for some reason it's almost customary to drive at breakneck speeds in vehicles which should not be on any road, let alone one as perilous as the Yungas Road. Yet their reason is horribly rational, given that it's better to risk death by speeding than to be caught on the road after sundown, for almost 70% of all Yungas Road deaths occur after nightfall, when a broken headlight or an overtired bus driver might mean a death sentence. Without a doubt, the worst time to drive is at the beginning of the rainy season, when huge waterfalls will drench the road and turn its surface to a deadly, slippery slime. Then will come those heart-stopping moments when wheels skid and brakes fail to grip, and even the best drivers fall to their deaths regardless of their skill or sobriety. There are stories told of truckers too tired or too afraid to continue, who pull over for the night, hoping to wait out the darkness so they may travel more safely by day. Yet some of these drivers have parked too close to the edge, and as they sleep in their cabs, the road is washed away around them. In 1 year alone, almost 30 vehicles of all shapes and sizes plunge off the road and into the ravine. That's one vehicle, sometimes full of whole families, every 2 weeks. Yet still the brave and the foolhardy continue to drive along the Yungas Road, and still, they're taken in their hundreds. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, and click the big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in massive compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, since the death of God, there's been a vacancy.